Thersites the Historian here. Today I would like to resume my series on the 2020 Democrats by looking at Tim Ryan, the 9-term congressman from Ohio. Ryan is on the weaker end of the candidates. He is not very well known. However, I think that by exploring some of these candidates, it gives us a good excuse to really look into the local politics of some of the states these people hail from, and it also enables us to get to know Congress just a little bit better. So I actually find this exercise useful even when we're looking at candidates like Tim Ryan, who don't realistically have any shot whatsoever. And I think that it's safe to say Tim Ryan has no shot because the man has some baggage that will make him completely unelectable in a Democratic primary. But I don't want to spoil it. So let's just pretend I didn't say that he was completely hopeless and instead pretend that this guy is a viable candidate. That way we can bring back the suspense and you can enjoy this video more. So let's look at Tim Ryan's life and career and then his prospects for becoming president. Timothy John Ryan was born on July 16, 1973 in Niles, Ohio. He is of mixed Irish and Italian heritage. After his parents divorced when he was about 7 years old, Ryan was raised by his mother, who remained single for the rest of his childhood. He became a football star, and he played quarterback in high school. He played well enough that he was recruited to play for Youngstown State University. However, his football career was derailed when he injured his knee, a common enough fate for college athletes. Later, he transferred to Bowling Green State University, he joined a frat, and he graduated with a BA in political science in 1995. So far, nothing stands out as being particularly interesting. To the left is a picture of Tim Ryan with his family now. He has one biological child by his wife, and he also has 2 stepchildren who were the children of his wife and her previous partner. So a fairly normal life, not too much to comment on here. The person who was more or less Tim Ryan's mentor in politics was none other than the internet famous Jim Traficant, a longtime Ohio congressman from Northeast Ohio in the area centered around Youngstown. And Ryan would have served for Traficant for a couple of years before he went off to law school in New Hampshire. Now, by explaining all about Jim Traficant, I'm actually not trying to link Tim Ryan and Jim Traficant, because they clearly are not the same. There are differences between them, and they became rivals once Tim Ryan came back from law school and really got into politics. However, I think that Traficant is worth looking at just because this guy is a fucking weirdo, and to be honest, he's way more interesting than Tim Ryan, so at least something in this video will be interesting. So Traficant was a conservative Democrat who was most notable for being strongly against immigration. He also was famous for saying "beam me up" when he was in Congress on the floor giving speeches and trying to express his exasperation for how absurd something was. Traficant was very charismatic, but he had hair that was arguably worse than Donald Trump's. The thing that Traficant was most known for, and the reason why I had heard of him in the past, was because back in 2002, he was expelled from the House of Representatives after being convicted of taking bribes, filing false tax returns, racketeering, and forcing aides to do chores on his farm and his boathouse in D.C., or houseboat, whatever it's called. There are people on the internet who claim that he was framed and that he is completely innocent. I've even seen a comment where someone said that Jim Traficant was the real-life Mr. Smith from the famous Mr. Smith Goes to Washington movie. However, the dude was a criminal, and the only reason he was able to persuade a small number of super gullible far-right people in Ohio that he was actually innocent is because they were extraordinarily stupid and he had charisma. So back to Tim Ryan and his political career. As we'll see, Jim Traficant continues to play a fairly major role in young Tim Ryan's career. In 2000, after getting his law degree, Ryan returned to Ohio and managed to win a seat in the Ohio State Senate. However, midway through his term in 2002, Traficant was expelled from the House and then Ryan decided to throw his hat into the ring and try to become a United States congressman. Now, at the time when this race was going on, there was redistricting, which extended the district into part of the city of Akron. And what this did was that it hurt former Democratic incumbent Tom Sawyer, since what was happening is that districts were being contracted since Ohio was shrinking relative to the rest of the country, as it still is, by the way. And that made Tom Sawyer have to defend a large portion of territory he had never represented. So even though he was an incumbent, he was not a formidable one. And there were also 4 other really weak challengers in the race. The main thing that really put Sawyer under, however, was that he had a weak record on labor, and in Northeast Ohio, that was especially at this time a major hub for auto manufacturing, and if you're not in good with the UAW, you're probably fucked. So that's what happened with Tom Sawyer, and this enabled Tim Ryan to win the primary. However, the saga was not over. So, Tim Ryan had won the primary, and now he was on the ballot in a race that should have been pretty easy. And it was. The Republicans only managed to put up an insurance commissioner with low name recognition, so Tim Ryan had a pretty easy job of things, especially since he was a Democrat in a district that heavily leaned Democrat. Another weird feature of the 2002 election in his district is that Jim Traficant, who was in prison at the time, decided to run as an independent, and he had even vowed that he would govern from prison if need be. Of course, he did not win, and Ryan was actually able to win pretty handily by a margin of 14 points. In January of 2003, Ryan took office as the youngest Democrat in the House of Representatives at the age of 29. So, this is the height of his career. He had achieved the status of United States Congressman. He had saved a district that the Democrats could have lost after Traficant's massive corruption scandal, because sometimes Democratic voters will vote Republican as a protest, whereas it rarely happens the other way around. So anyway, he had avoided a seat loss in 2002 when Bush was at the height of his popularity, because if you'll remember, Bush was pretty much the only president in the modern era to actually win seats in his first midterm, because he was still riding high on the good feelings and solidarity of Americans after 9/11. Anyway, what we'll see is that after he gets elected, Tim Ryan really doesn't achieve much outside of continuing to be reelected. Of his 8 reelections, 7 were without a serious challenger in either the primary or the general. The only hard race that he faced was in 2010 when the Republicans had the big wave, but even that one he managed to survive with about 53% of the vote or so. And actually, it was either 2010 or 2012 when Jim Traficant was released from prison and decided to mount yet another campaign as an independent, where he stole some of the vote. I believe that was actually 2012. Anyway, Traficant was in prison for 7 years. Before we move off of Traficant, in the previous slide I showed a tractor. That was the tractor that Jim Traficant died while riding. He was trying to park his tractor in his barn, and somehow he ran over an obstacle. The tractor flipped over and fell on him, and he was effectively smothered or suffocated to death. Now, it sounds really weird, and a lot of people on the internet have speculated that he was the victim of assassination because he was too much of a threat to the power establishment. The problem is, Traficant had been irrelevant for years, and at this point, he was just an anti-Semitic crank running around on his tractor with a terrible haircut. He was Joe Don Baker with worse hair. Anyway, I don't want to get into my beef with conspiracy theorists and their lack of understanding of basic things like motive and plausibility, but we'll move on back to Tim Ryan, although I don't want to. In 2012, his district was adjusted yet again in another way which favored him. Now, basically all of Akron was within his district, and this makes the district even safer. So in 2010, he'd faced a fairly major challenge, he had fended it off, and he was rewarded with getting an even safer district. So this means he must have been in good with the establishment, because if you compare his fate with someone who was a bit of a renegade against the establishment, Dennis Kucinich, what happened when Ohio contracted that same year is that he was forced to compete with fellow Democrat Marcy Kaptur when their districts were merged in Cleveland, and the way that they were merged favored Kaptur. She won. She's still in Congress. Kucinich has not been able to find an office since. So Tim Ryan must have been playing ball, and he must have been talking to the right people. And by right people, I mean the corporate Democrats who hold committee assignments and decide what decisions are made, to quote Steny Hoyer. So back to the glorious record of achievement of one Congressman Tim Ryan. So, as I promised at the beginning, this man has some deadly baggage which will prevent him from ever getting within sight of the Democratic nomination. And he gave himself this baggage early. In his first term, this is when Congress voted on the Stupak Amendment, which would restrict federal funding for abortions. And Tim Ryan, as an ardent Catholic and an ardent pro-life person, decided to vote for the Stupak Amendment. This is something that has been hanging over his head ever since, like a sword of Damocles, since the Democratic Party as a whole, while it prides itself on being a big tent, is not all that tolerant of deviation on social views, at least not in the last several years. So Ryan had to walk that back in January of 2015. So I give him credit for not changing his stance because he was running for president. I don't think he ever anticipated running for president back in 2015. However, I do think that Tim Ryan is calculating enough that when he changed his stance back then, he was already eyeing the speakership. Because Tim Ryan actually has had bigger dreams for a long time, and those dreams have not always been on Pennsylvania Avenue. In 2010, Ryan introduced by far his most impressive, successful, and good piece of legislation, the Reform for Fair Trade Act, which called for trade tariffs on China and other currency manipulators. The bill passed the House fairly overwhelmingly, but was never introduced in the Senate. This was actually something that would have been very popular with his constituents back home. It would have helped to protect their jobs in the auto industry, and this would have also helped to protect American workers elsewhere. So this showed that Ryan was actually at least aware of a major issue that could benefit his constituents and the American public to some degree. However, this was an isolated act. I've seen no other evidence of Ryan doing anything of this nature. If he did more stuff like this, he might actually have a chance right now to become president. Or he might have actually been able to mount a strong case for becoming the Speaker of the House. But he didn't. He's mostly just been a very milquetoast Democrat, and sometimes he's even been a hawkish, not hawkish, but an ardent social conservative, at least in his earlier days. But again, we can't cry over spilled milk. Ryan has made his bed, and he will lie in it alone with 0% of the vote. One fun thing to do when it comes to 2020 presidential candidates is to look at the stances that they are known to have taken before they decided they wanted to be president. Because this might give us a better idea of what these people actually believe and who they are. And with Tim Ryan, there is something of a mixed bag, although it's a little more negative than positive, but it's not as bad as I expected. So in 2004, when the Bush administration was still popular, and when several conservative Democrats were trying to cleave close to the Republicans, i.e. Joe Lieberman, Tim Ryan, surprisingly, was against the Bush administration and against the Iraq War. Now, among more blue-collar Democrats at that time, the war was still reasonably popular. So Tim Ryan was actually showing some degree of courage by taking that stand. I mean, I imagine he voted incorrectly when it came to actually going to Iraq, but when it came to realizing the mistake, he seems to have been willing to do so, at least to some extent. As I mentioned earlier, he was staunchly pro-life due to his Catholicism until 2015. So if he did have some sort of conversion, then at least it was not just to run for president, but it might have been for broader political considerations. At any rate, it's a good thing that he is not a pro-lifer right now when we have some of the most extreme abortion bills in history being passed. Bill's so extreme, by the way, that even Pat Robertson is like, God damn, guys, let's slow down. Tim Ryan, another thing that he has going against him in the Democratic primary is that he received an A rating from the NRA up until 2017. Now, if you'll recall in 2016, Hillary Clinton hit Bernie Sanders fairly effectively for his gun voting record when he only had a D- from the NRA. So the gold standard within the Democratic Party on guns is you need an F rating from the NRA. Because he had an A rating all the way up to 2017, this is going to be a real millstone around his neck if he ever attracts enough attention that people look into his record. However, after the Las Vegas shootings, he had an epiphany and decided that he was no longer a gun guy. Which again, did take a little bit of balls because he's in a district that includes a lot of rural territory and a lot of kind of northern rednecky people. So they are a pro-gun crowd in Youngstown and Akron. And I don't mean that as an insult, I just don't know exactly how to describe them. But at any rate, because they're kind of economically liberal but socially conservative, that's more or less what that area is like. Tim Ryan supports the Iran nuclear deal and preventing Iran from acquiring WMDs. That's a sensible policy. It's very mainstream Democrat, but when we have people who apparently would rather send in troops and fight a war rather than do a bloodless deal where you just don't allow them to have nukes, I guess this is a positive. That shows us how shitty our political system actually is, when having common sense on a super obvious issue is a virtue. And predictably, like pretty much every politician ever, Ryan has publicly stated his support for Israel. And the reason why I brought up some of this really generic shit is because Ryan very much is not a policy guy, and there isn't much. I had to dig pretty hard to find even this. So if you think that I'm just finding the most surface level stuff that could apply to any Democrat, you're right, but also I challenge you to do better. The defeat of Hillary Clinton at the hands of Donald Trump really sent shockwaves throughout the Democratic Party. Every faction within the party was pretty stunned by what happened, and everyone realized that something had gone horribly wrong. And in Congress, this took the form of Tim Ryan quickly organizing an opposition to Pelosi's leadership of the minority party. So he tried to challenge her as minority leader, and he tried to do so from the right. He does seem to have mounted a more competent campaign in this regard than Heath Shuler, who back in 2010, after the Democrats lost the House, tried to challenge Pelosi as Democratic leader from the right by saying that they needed a new quarterback, thus alluding to his college football days. He also challenged from the right and said that they had to move right to acknowledge they had been beaten by the Republicans or some dumb shit. Anyway, Tim Ryan sort of did a little bit of the same thing, but instead of talking about moving to the right necessarily, he talked a little bit more about geography, about how the Democrats had lost in the heartland of America, and they needed more leadership from the middle of the country rather than the coastal elites. And in that regard, he actually had a pretty good point, because the Democrats do message and present themselves a lot of times in a very New York and LA way, which doesn't necessarily translate to a lot of the middle of the country. However, Ryan was ultimately defeated 134 to 63 after Pelosi promised to create more leadership opportunities for younger members. Whether she's actually done so or not is open to debate, but she said what she needed to say to stave off a challenge. And by the way, by challenging Pelosi, Tim Ryan has made himself something of a marked man, it would seem, from the establishment. So while there are a lot of establishment candidates in this race who, if they were able to take off somehow and mount a major challenge against Bernie, they could expect a big boost from the party, Tim Ryan might actually not be one of them, surprisingly. While Nancy Pelosi might be considering trying to revoke Tim Ryan's establishment credentials, the fact is that when it comes to being part of the hashtag resistance, Tim Ryan is one of the leaders. And by the hashtag resistance, what I mean are those neoliberal Democrats who scream and shout from the rooftops about Trump's fascist tendencies, yet vote for all of his policies. When he wants to cut taxes by trillions, they are in lockstep with him. However, when he tries to build a wall which won't actually really affect anything and only cost a few $1 billion, the Democrats are outraged and they're willing to fight to the death on this issue and really go to the mat and try to attack him all over the media and stop it from happening. And Tim Ryan is the perfect example, because what he did was he found one guy's inspirational story to that way establish himself as someone who was reasonable, yet someone who was still more or less anti-immigration. So he was trying to find a triangulated position between Trump's position and what a lot of more liberal Democrats are calling for. And the whole thing is a relatively disgusting spectacle. So what Tim Ryan did was find one of his constituents named Audie Othman. He is an illegal immigrant living in Youngstown, or at least he was living in Youngstown. Othman has lived in the United States for 40 years. He owns several local businesses, and he was married to a U.S. citizen. He also had 4 citizen children. This is someone who is clearly a productive member of society and someone who does not pose any of the threats or challenges that Trump was fear-mongering about. So he is an effective symbol of the antithesis of the kind of fear that Trump was trying to raise. And it would be a good idea politically to uphold Audie Othman as a counterexample if you're trying to argue in favor of something like amnesty. However, Ryan's whole objective was just centered around this one guy to that way build up his credibility to make a deal, which would ultimately screw over a lot more people we don't know of who are basically like Audie Othman. He would present a bill in Congress calling for a review of Othman's case, because what would happen is while this bill was in review, then Othman could get a temporary reprieve. However, in February of 2018, Trump ordered ICE to intensify arrests and deportations, and Othman was among those deported. This whole time, while Ryan was fighting really hard on the side of Audie Othman, he was calling for a middle ground and basically urging all of his Democratic colleagues to cave to Trump's immigration policy and just try to fight a few of the details here and there. So this is why the hashtag resistance is bullshit, and it's also why neoliberal triangulation is a terrible idea, which only produces policies that are ineffectual and that are simply not good for the country as a whole. When I was doing some of the preliminary background research for this video, I was looking at old clips of Jim Traficant, and in one of the clips he asked, "Where's the beef?" Well, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea where the beef of Tim Ryan's campaign is. I think that he must be running a vegetarian campaign or a ramen noodle campaign, because honestly, of all the candidates I've looked at, and I've looked at most of them, or at least over half at this point in some capacity or other, I think he might take the cake for having the least substantive of all of their campaigns. You can't find any information on policies by going to Ryan's 2020 page or his congressional page. So it's mind-boggling how little there is in terms of policy. He acknowledged on the show The View that the economic orthodoxy of cutting taxes to solve all problems that we have seen since 1980 has not worked. I like the sound of that. It sounds like he's on the right track. I imagine he's not going to do anything with that or propose something like readjusting the tax code to make sure that rich people pay taxes. But at least he is aware that Reaganomics doesn't work. And again, this is something that he said on The View. It has not appeared on either of his web pages. So it's something he said that could help him in the primary, that would also maybe lead to a good policy outcome at some point. But I had to find this by Googling him randomly, and this came up. He also claims on healthcare to have supported both single payer and the Affordable Care Act. I don't know what that means. So I guess it's safe to say he doesn't really have a stance on healthcare. Or I guess really when Democrats say that they're in favor of both Medicare for All and the ACA. What they mean is they're really in favor of the ACA, and that's it. He has stated before that he wants to, quote, restore the dignity of a secure retirement. I don't know what that means in terms of policy. I would hope that would mean that he wants to secure Social Security by making sure that it's funded and protecting it from being cut. But again, this is not clear. It's just a talking point. Another, I guess what you could call issue that he has is that he advocates 21st century family farms in his book, The Real Food Revolution. Whereas most candidates were writing books about themselves or their platforms, Tim Ryan has written 2 books in the last several years, the first of which was about meditation, and the second of which was about this bullshit. So he's running a deeply substantive campaign, and I really don't understand why he's getting so few votes. Why aren't people excited for family farming? I mean, isn't that really what Americans are thinking about right now? So what are Tim Ryan's prospects? Well, for becoming president, his prospects are effectively zero. His social conservative past and his lack of policy substance mean that I can't see a possibility where he wins the Democratic primary. He engages in limited economic populism here and there, and that means that he actually has more understanding of Ohio politics than most other Ohio Democrats. In fact, and I hate to say this because it's painful to say this, but in Ohio there are only 2 people who seem to understand Ohio politics better than Tim Ryan, and that's Sherrod Brown, who won when the Republicans were surging by running to the left on economics, and Dennis Kucinich, who can't win because he gets smeared, but he does seem to understand where a lot of Ohioans stand on key issues. Well, that, he talks a lot about believing in UFOs and some other stuff. Anyway, so if that tells you how frustrating Ohio politics are, that Tim Ryan is sort of the bronze standard for Democrats, yeah. Ohio is very winnable for Democrats, but they just won't run anybody who's not a complete moron. Despite being center-right, his challenge to Pelosi means that he's also not favored by the establishment. So if he were to somehow surge as the alternative to Bernie Sanders, the party would be at pains to really rig it on his behalf, because he has offended the Queen of the House. He could be a weak option for a VP pick. Someone might think that they need to add him to try to win over the Midwest, or that he might bring in Ohio, or he might represent younger voters, or he might balance the ticket by putting someone who's more conservative on it. I don't know. But in terms of his prospects, I think he's just going to stay in the House. I can't really see him becoming a cabinet member either, because he doesn't really have an area of policy expertise. The man is allergic to public policy. So I don't think he's going anywhere. And if anything, by exposing himself in this way, he's probably opening himself up to eventual strong primary challengers who will realize that he is not a good congressman and want to get rid of him. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Tim Ryan. Next time we will talk about Seth Moulton, who is effectively the Tim Ryan of Massachusetts.